Mhm. I mean, yes and no, but I feel like there's a lot of, for me, there's a lot of pleasure in looking at a book in which I was learning to write prose, pretty much. I mean, I think I was moving from being a poet to, and I was doing, in that time, I was doing some journalism, book reviewing, and art writing, and little bits and pieces. But I didn't have a confidence in prose as opposed to poetry. And so the book was so much, like these, I mean, learning about length, I think, which is a real, the transition, I think, from being a poet to a fiction writer or a prose writer is the capacity to produce that much. I really, and so I was, it was, so in it, like a lot of the interest in me in looking at the book was seeing, kind of looking over my shoulder and watching me figure things out, like how to manage sentences and rhythm, and what I allowed myself, because in some ways the book is more radical than the way I write now. I mean, and I think I definitely have friends who still prefer it, and like that's what you always suffer with, I think, when you write a book that people like, that people hold on to certain parts of your overall creation. But yeah, I mean, I indeed still am. I mean, Eileen was very much a character at the time of writing it. The character was more excessive and more, there was an idealization in it, because I think there was a need for female heroes and queer heroes, and I had a few on the horizon, but not many. And so I had very much a desire to perform as that, to construct that, and so I let myself be a little meaner and a little dumber and a little more innocent and a little more oblivious. And so and so that freedom, of course, drove it too. So I feel good about I mean, it was like when I had to read it for the do the final read before it went to print, I was moved, because I thought, okay, I like this book. I still feel good about this work. And yeah, I should say that there was a gap, of course, between it went out of print in about 2007 and was out of print for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, which was very nerve-wracking, because I was hell-bent on getting it republished with a good press, a bigger press, and lots of smaller presses were coming forward and making bids. And so there was a question of confidence of whether, by withholding it from the world, because people really talk to you in a kind of failed way. They were like, oh, that's too bad about Chelsea Girls. Like, like you're not allowed to, you can't get your book into the world. So I had to endure what felt like mild humiliation while I was hanging on to a plan. Well, I couldn't be that same writer, and I couldn't be at that same place in my work. But I confirmed that this was, I stood by that message, and said yes. And I had no desire to change anything. I felt very much against that. It just seemed like it has to stand as it was, as a document of that moment. Yeah, I mean, I think, I will say too, it's just like, I know I've said this before, but I think one of the things that was important to me too, I think I was introduced to art largely through film. I lived in Boston near Cambridge. So even though I lived in a suburban town, it was very easy to get to Harvard Square, where there were, experimental with theaters that showed art films, what we called art films at the time. And so I saw Truffaut, I saw 400 Blows, and I saw this whole series of films about the development of a young man, and it started in childhood, and then he was a teenager, and then he was a young man, and then he was, and it was just like the development of this character, Antoine Daniel. And I felt very intensely that there was no Antoine Daniel, there was no female Antoine Daniel. And so I very much wanted to make, and again, because I didn't really know what fiction was or what that meant, what was the difference between nonfiction and fiction, what was the difference between documentary and film, and imaginative work, and work that simply iterated what had happened. But my goal very much was to make a bunch of short films from the life of a character like Eileen Myles. And my joke was, of course, that I had access to these memories, so why not use these as opposed to fictionalizing somebody? So that, but it was very much, the intention was to have very distinct slices from a female life. And, even when I finished the book, I thought, but wait, I was sexually assaulted. I can't not include that. So that I very deliberately wrote a chapter, I think it was called Pomponesset, just to describe being sexually assaulted at 18, because that had to be in a female account of a coming of age, and I was very interested in whether the question of whether coming of age meant becoming a writer or getting raped, because coming of age as a man is often, he has sex with a prostitute, he has this, or it would often be this kind of capitalist using that a man had in order to lose his virginity. And I felt, no, I think for a lot of women, it was a very bad, if not assaultive experience that meant, quote, coming of age. Yeah, I think loneliness is a space, and is almost like a space to be celebrated and occupied. I think that, again, I think being female and being queer, and now, I consider myself trans at this time, but I think that there are all kinds of feelings and affects that if one were to reveal, like you say, like how many times has anyone sat in a bar either by themselves or with another female and had some male character come up and say, you two seem lonely, or if you're eating alone, you seem lonely. And there's just the singularity of a female character is somehow disturbing and is an empty space that needs to be taken. And I think it felt really important to show, sensitive, feeling, abject, awkward, humiliated kind of ways of being, and to not feel that there was anything wrong or anything empty about those states. I felt like these were parts of my badges of acquiring, a kind of a selfhood. So I think of, obviously loneliness is pithy and is a kind of a the word, I want to use the word triggering in a non-negative way. Triggers writing and creation, and more reflection. Yeah, I think even when it was first came out, it was sort of received that it was just like, why do I want to hear about this pathetic, the details or the days or like now when we look at something like Now Scarred, and we see that one can spend thousands and thousands of pages giving the details of a, so that every bit of it, whether it was detail or affect, seemed valuable and new, actually. Oh, it's very funny because I think that in retrospect, I realized that, and I'm talking personally now, that at 23, I was pretty convinced my life was over. I remember that feeling, and having it. And I think that that's been one of, I think people who write and people who don't ever get around to writing have a tendency to allegorize their existence and think, oh, look where you wound up, when in fact it's only a place where you're sitting, And so I think age is very much like that, it's that I can think a lot of things about the age I am right now, which is 70. And I, certainly had different opinions. I remember turning 40 was very difficult. I just think, you've never been, it always is a new space. You've never been, quote, that number, and then as you move into it, it simply just seems a different version of where you've already been with certain physical realities, of course, and even responsibilities and maybe different demands of your environment, and your environment reflects differently on you. And you can't, I remember years ago being in some kind of situation where somebody was complaining about being the person with blue hair, and people were always talking to her about having her blue hair. And, you know, it seems so obvious that if you have blue hair, people will talk to you about blue hair, you know, and I think everything is like that. It's like, I feel, you know, when I walk into a grocery store and get called ma'am, you know, I'm horrified both by the gender and even that they might think at my point in age that I deserve that respect, or, you know, and that it's like that, you know, we're powerless over how we're received in a certain way, but we certainly have a lot of space in terms of how we conduct the interior and move forward from that place. You know, it's so deeply relative and yet completely real, and just like death is real. You know.